Commander is a crazy format where a ton of different cards see play and there's a ton of possibilities for what you can do in the deck building stage. However, there are also a ton of cards in Magic, and with Commander being eternal legal, it means there's a ton of cards for you to choose from when you're building your Commander decks. Because of that, there are a ton of cards that fly under the radar because they just don't pop up or you may have never seen them before. So in today's video, I'm going to be breaking down 10 of my favorite picks for cards that have less than 1% play in Commander that you might want to consider putting in your Commander decks because they're pretty awesome. Now, obviously, if you're wanting to build the most optimized CEDH deck ever, some of these cards are just not going to be good in that situation. But these are awesome cards for those casual Commander games where they're a lot of fun, pretty powerful, and are going to make your friends go, wait, what's that card do? Before we jump into this, I do want to say thank you to Wizards of the Coast for sponsoring this video. Learn more in the link in the description and pinned comment below. Let's jump right into this. First off, we have Tail's End. This is a 2-cost blue instant that says counter target activated ability, triggered ability, or legendary spell. This is a pretty interesting counter spell because it doesn't let you counter typical spells. Board wipes, removal, things like that. It's not really meant to take the place of a protection counter spell, but this can really easily take the place of a kill spell in your deck, allowing you to consistently counter your opponent's commanders, but also consistently counter activated or triggered abilities. It's something that I think is really overlooked in Commander. Stifling abilities can be really powerful, and it's something a lot of the time your opponents aren't accounting for. If you have 2 blue mana up, your opponents are going to be expecting a counter spell, but they're not necessarily going to be expecting you to counter their activated or triggered abilities, which makes this card really fun, stopping things like Planeswalker ultimates, enter the battlefield effects, leave the battlefield effect, or just legendary spells like Planeswalkers and of course Commanders. This card just seems super versatile, and it's going to throw your opponents off who are expecting something more traditional like a counter spell, and so I think it's a really fun card that only sees play in 1% of decks that can run it. Next up, Out of Time is a 3-cost white enchantment that says, when Out of Time enters the battlefield, untap all creatures, then phase them out until Out of Time leaves the battlefield. Put a time counter on Out of Time for each creature phased out this way, and then it has Vanishing. So at the beginning of your upkeep, you remove a time counter, and when the last one is removed, you have to sacrifice the enchantment. When you read the card, it seems a lot like a temporary board wipe, where you're going to take creatures off the board, and then a couple turns later, they're all going to come back, which may not seem good on its face. But because the number of time counters is equal to the amount of creatures that you phase out, a lot of the time this is going to phase out 9, 10, 11 creatures, and games just don't go that long in terms of turns. The second you're phasing out 5 or 6 creatures, it means they're pretty much gone for the rest of the game unless someone happens to remove this enchantment. But what's interesting is because this only costs 3 mana, it's really awesome for wiping the board and then letting you deploy immediately. One of the biggest downsides of board wipes is that you spend all your mana to activate them, you wipe the board, and you're the last person that gets to recover because you had to spend the mana to board wipe. With this, the low mana value means that you're likely to be able to at least play 1 or 2 things after it. And that doesn't account for the fact that this doesn't destroy creatures, it phases them out. So it gets around things like indestructible, and it means your things aren't switching zones. That means you don't get to put your commander back in the command zone, and you can actually stop everyone from having access to their commander, which isn't the most fun thing in the world, but it can be very powerful against opponents who are relying on their commander to be there. Overall, it's a really unique board wipe, and I think it has a lot of advantages in a lot of decks. Next up, Withering Boon is an old one, and a kinda simple one, but it's really awesome. It's 1 in a black for an instant that has you pay 3 life to counter target creature spell. This is a black counter spell, which is really rare to see. Typically, blue gets counter spells, sometimes white gets weird counter spells, and occasionally red will get a very narrow counter spell. But black getting one is incredibly rare. Now, there's a couple aspects to this. First off, it can only counter creature spells, which black is already one of the best colors at removing creatures, so it's not really, that groundbreaking. It's not allowing black to interact with enchantments in a new way, for example. But it's very on cost. For 2 mana, you get to get rid of a creature, but the advantage here is you get to do it before it enters the battlefield, allowing you to dodge things like enter the battlefield effects, or allowing you to prevent your opponents from just getting a creature down that may trigger other things, or, have an effect that you can't necessarily respond to. There are a lot of times where a creature entering the battlefield is enough to cause a trigger that you really didn't want to happen, and this allows black to react to things before they hit the battlefield, which it's normally not really able to do. Overall, it's a really weird card that I think a lot of people could put in their decks. Next up, Make an Example is a 4-cost black sorcery that says each opponent separates the creatures they control into 2 piles. For each opponent, you choose one of their piles. Each opponent sacrifices the creature in the pile chosen. This is a really interesting spell, because for 4 mana, you essentially get to kill whatever you want on any of your opponent's boards. Because at worst, you want to kill one thing from player A and one thing from player C, and they decide to put those in one pile and the rest in a different pile. In that situation, it's still pretty good for just 4 mana, letting you pick those things to kill, and it gets around things like indestructible and hexproof because you choose the pile, you don't target the pile or target a creature or anything like that. So just on that, it seems pretty good. But a lot of the time, if your opponents have a lot of creatures, they're going to have to make the piles a little bit more even, and you're going to get to kill multiple things per opponent. So I feel like it's really, really awesome and is going to put a lot of stress on your opponents in picking those piles. And unlike a lot of the cards that make piles, you ultimately get to make the decision. It's not like you are making piles and your opponents choose. They make the piles, you choose. So you get to at least guarantee that one creature that you want gone is going to be gone. And I think it's really awesome for just 4 mana. Next up, Genesis is a 5-cost green 4/4 creature, but we don't really care about that because it doesn't have any abilities on the battlefield. It says at the beginning of your upkeep, if Genesis is in your graveyard, you may pay 3 mana. If you do, return target creature card from your graveyard to your hand. This gives you a consistent way to return creatures from your graveyard to your hand, and while that's not cheating mana cost, what's awesome about the card is that you essentially get to play it without paying any mana as long as your deck cares about milling or discarding or sacrificing creatures. As long as this thing is in your graveyard, you get that effect. So a lot of the time, you're going to mill this into your graveyard, discard it, and not have to pay any mana to at least get that option every upkeep. If you have a card that cares about, discarding a card to draw a card, it feels like a very free discard and gets you some choice later on in the game, and I think it's just a lot of fun in those cases. This one is a little bit more specific than my other cards I've talked about so far. It does have to go in a kind of particular type of deck, unlike the previous picks, but I think in those decks where you are consistently putting things in your graveyard, it's a great choice to put in there, as it lets you consistently get value, and it's a lot harder for your opponents to interact with. Next, Chef's Kiss is a 3-cost red instant that has you gain control of target spell that targets only a single permanent or player. Then you get to copy it, then reselect targets at random for the spell and the copy, but the new targets can't be you or a permanent you control. This is a fun spell to protect your stuff in red, which typically doesn't get to do that too often, allowing you to basically reselect the targets of something that's targeting you, but then get another copy. Let's say an opponent just tries to kill one of your creatures with a spell. You get to make that copy target someone else, and you actually gain control of the spell. So if it has some other side effect, like for example, you get to surveil 2 or something like that, you actually get to do the surveil and kill another creature, although the target is chosen at random. And then you get to copy that spell in addition. So then you make another copy, you target another thing, you get another surveil 2. This thing can just really blow your opponents out if they spend, 5 mana on a spell that targets you or one of your creatures. It then could end up targeting them, it could target one of your opponents, but the important thing is it can't target you. So essentially, you dodge a removal spell, you get a little bit of extra bonus, and you kill something else on the board, which seems pretty good for 3 mana. Next up, Cemetery Prowler is a 3-cost green 3/4 wolf with vigilance, and when it enters the battlefield or attacks, you exile a card from a graveyard. Then, spells you cast cost 1 less to cast for each card type they share with cards exiled with Cemetery Prowler. This is just generally good if your deck cares about a specific creature type, most likely creatures because it itself is a creature, allowing you to exile a creature under it to make all of your creatures cost 1 less for just 3 mana. But why this is good and why it made the list is because it's also Graveyard Hate. I think Graveyard Hate is undervalued in Commander, although I will say recently I think people are starting to realize how important it is. Cemetery Prowler allows you to exile a problematic card right away, and then every turn attack to exile problematic cards from graveyards, and potentially just reduce the cost of your spells. It's not uncommon that you could play a Cemetery Prowler even if your deck doesn't care about one creature type, and if you exile 2 or 3 cards, it's just going to make most of your spells cost 1 less. Plus, it's a 3/4 for 3 with vigilance, so it, does a decent job blocking and attacking, and can just do a lot of work if you care about creatures in some way, and overall, I think it just does a lot for 3 mana. It's not particularly amazing at any one thing, but, Graveyard Hate, cost reduction, and being a pretty good statted creature is pretty nice. Next up, Leadership Vacuum is a 3-cost blue instant that says target player returns each commander they control from the battlefield to the command zone, then draw a card. This is a pretty crazy removal spell because it has some weird implications that some people may not realize. First off, returning something to the command zone is essentially killing it. Your commander tax is not based on how many times your commander died or anything like that. It's based on the number of times you've cast your commander from the command zone. So this essentially kills each commander target player controls and then replaces the card in your hand. This is good for a couple reasons. First off, it's really good against partners or backgrounds or any, form of thing where they have 2 different commanders. This will return both of them. It also gets around things like indestructible and hexproof because you target the player and it's not killing, it's returning from a zone to another zone. At its face, it's 3 mana to destroy target commander and draw a card, which doesn't seem bad. 3 mana removal spells that then replace themselves in your hand, it seemed pretty good, and while it is limited in what it can target, it does get around some major hurdles that a lot of people like to do. Protection, Shroud, Hexproof, Indestructible are very common things, and this allows you to dodge all of those, and so it's because of that, it seems like a pretty good inclusion. Next up, Warping Wail is a 2-cost colorless instant that has you choose one. Exile target creature with power or toughness 1 or less, counter target sorcery spell, or create a 1/1 colorless Eldrazi Scion creature token that has the ability to sack to add a colorless mana. This is a pretty interesting spell because it's colorless, meaning it can be run in any deck, but it requires an actual colorless mana symbol. So outside of a colorless deck, unless you're in an artifact deck, it is a little bit difficult to run. However, I do think if your deck is built right, you can run this in like a mono or maybe even 2-color deck. A lot of the time, those 2 or 1-color decks are going to run a lot of artifacts that produce colorless mana. Things like the Ironcrag from Wilds of Eldraine are not as big of a downside only producing colorless mana in those low color count decks. Because of that, this can just be really shocking. It can be in literally any deck, and it can just target any sorcery. It's not super limited like white and red counterspells typically are, and so I think you can throw off a lot of your opponents by running this card. And finally, Search the Premises is a 4-cost white enchantment that says whenever a creature attacks you or a planeswalker you control, investigate. This is a really simple enchantment, but the thing that can sometimes be missed here is it's per creature that attacks you, not per attack. So if you get attacked with 5 1/1s, you get to make 5 artifacts that then allow you to draw cards. So at its face, this allows you to pay 2 mana per creature that attacks you to draw a card, which isn't the worst thing in the world, especially when you can kind of save those up for later. But I think this is especially good if your deck cares about either tokens or artifacts, which a lot of them are, especially in recent times. This card just seems like a pretty good way to generate a ton of artifacts, get you a lot of card draw if you really need it, especially in white, which doesn't necessarily draw as many cards as some other colors, and it just seems like a pretty good effect that will disincentivize meaningless attacks on you. How many times in a commander game, will someone go, I need to attack someone, I don't really care who it is, and it just happens to be you? Well, this should reduce that because they're going to go, well, it doesn't matter who I swing at in this case, or, I can swing at these 2 people, but you're going to get a clue out of it, so I might as well swing that way. I think that this card can do a lot of things in a lot of different games, and it's just an interesting card to play around both as an opponent and as someone who has it on the battlefield. Alright guys, those are 10 of my favorite overlooked cards for Commander. Let me know your thoughts on them in the comments down below, and leave your suggestions for cards I should add to my Commander decks that aren't necessarily the most popular cards around. If you enjoyed, hit that like button, subscribe, also check out the link in the description and pinned comment below, and I will see you guys in the next one. Bye.